and have spent a good deal of my life doing. Joel does that in spades, and he does it at a particularly opportune time, simply because we're at an inflection point in terms of how corporate law is evolving. I acted for a company called BCE in a control contest which ended up being litigated to the Supreme Court of Canada. And after that experience where the Supreme Court, in a not particularly well-reasoned decision, but in a decision that clearly indicated the issues that they're struggling with, and clearly evidenced their sympathy for this concept of reasonable social expectations indicating the trajectory of the law. Ever since that experience, I've said at the beginning of my business law course every fall, this is a history course. We can talk about what the law is like today, but the only thing I can tell you with absolute certainty is that it will be fundamentally different by the time you get out, assuming you decide to pursue some sort of career dealing with these concepts. Basic concepts of corporate law: best interests of the corporation, the nature of share ownership, limited liability, some of the concepts that spill over into securities law, like the concept of materiality. It's jump ball on all of them. Joel is one of the key actors from an academic perspective in that process. He's asking a lot of sort of the fundamental questions. And as with many policy exercises, sometimes asking the right questions is as important or perhaps more important than coming up with answers, because there aren't necessarily right answers. So while Joel and I may diverge a little bit in terms of where we think the answers are, and that might be the basis for some of our discussion, he's bang on in terms of identifying the questions and articulating them in a way that makes them accessible to a much broader community. And for that, I am, and I think we should all be, grateful to him and delighted to have the opportunity to hear him speak.
I'm a little shorter than Ed, so I'm going to put this down. Well, thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me. These are really, I mean, I give a lot of talks each year, and these are the kinds I like to do most. Sort of young scholars, brilliant scholars, passionately engaged scholars. It's the pure intellectual pursuit that you're interested in. As you go on in your careers, you'll become more interested in whether you have the corner office in your department. You'll become more interested in who's on what committee and all of the angels dancing on the head of a pin issues of academic politics. But at this moment, right now, where you are, it's just the pure intellectual pursuit, and that's a beautiful thing, and I'm just wafting in the energy of that. So thank you for inviting me here. And I also want to say, I love Osgoode Hall. I left reluctantly. I taught there in the late 80s and early 90s. My wife got a job at UBC, so that took us out to Vancouver. But I left there kicking and screaming, because you're really lucky to be at an institution that has a history and present of looking at law in a critical way, looking at law in an interdisciplinary way. I mean, I really think Osgoode stands out, perhaps less now because other institutions have caught up to it. But Osgoode is really a pioneer in that respect in Canada, and I loved my time there for that reason. Some of my dearest friends still teach there. My mentor, Harry Glassbeak, I think is Professor Emeritus and occasionally shows up there. And I'd actually like to dedicate this talk to him, because the ideas in it are ideas that he's been talking about for at least the last 30 years. And thank you also to Ali. and to Turin for just being so gracious, so generous in getting me here. And last but not least, thank you to Ed for that very generous introduction. The title of my talk, Good Corp, Bad Corp, it alludes, I think, fairly obviously to the good cop, bad cop routine, which some of you are probably, or most of you are probably familiar with from popular culture, hopefully not from having experienced an interrogation. And generally, you've got two officers. One is hostile, abusive. You've all seen this in Hollywood. The other is friendly and supportive, and they take turns questioning a suspect who, if all goes according to plan, the suspect confesses to the crime, partly out of a belief that the good cop's promises are genuine and that the good cop will be a friend and protect him. And so they get the confession. Good corps, corporations that purport to be socially responsible, are kind of like good cops. At least that's my argument today. They present themselves as caring, as supportive, in the hopes that society and governments, like the interrogated suspect, will drop their guard, will relax their scrutiny, will relax their regulatory vigilance. And this wouldn't be a problem, of course, if good corps were truly good. And it wouldn't be a problem for the interrogated suspect if good cops were truly good. But that's not the case. For both good corporations and good cops, goodness, I'm going to suggest, is feigned, its appearance, it's calculated and strategic deception, and it's designed to achieve institutional ends. And in both instances, it's the targets of the tactic, society or the interrogated suspect, as it may be, that ends up paying the price for being duped. That is, in the end, broken by the deception. And hence the subtitle to this talk, CSR and the Breaking of Society. So let me begin to develop this argument by putting some concrete examples on the table. I'm sure all of you have been told by your advisors when you come with your sort of hyper-theoretical and abstract drafts, you need concrete examples. So I'm going to put a few on the table here. And the first is an energy company. And this energy company was a true corporate social responsibility trailblazer. Back in the 1990s, before it was even fashionable to do this, this company was issuing corporate social responsibility reports. It was undertaking to cut greenhouse gas emissions, to support multilateral agreements on climate change, put human rights, the environment, health and safety, transparency, indigenous rights. It did it all at the core of its business plan. The company gave lots of money to cultural organizations, to artistic organizations. It was consistently ranked by its employees as one of the best places to work in the United States. We believe the company stated in its annual report, its last annual report, we believe the company stated that corporate leadership should set the example for community service. Unfortunately, the company could not continue with its good works after it came crashing down in a sort of wave of hubris and criminality. The company I'm talking about, you may have guessed by now, is Enron. Now, shortly after Enron collapsed, Hank McKinnell, who I had the great privilege to interview, he was CEO of Pfizer, the world's largest pharmaceutical company. And I asked him, what do you think of this huge thing that just happened with Enron? He said, that was just a very isolated incident. That's a quote. Good corporate citizen, he said, is the norm. He insisted that some companies, including his own, actually went beyond that to be stellar corporate citizens. Pfizer can be the company, he told me, which does more good for more people than any other company on the planet. And he gave me a lot of evidence for that, handing out free drugs to cure trachoma in Africa, rebuilding inner city neighborhoods in New York, partnering with schools, helping put safety gates into subways, on subway platforms. It's all kinds of things. But even as Mr. McKinnell was speaking, his company was covertly committing crimes that by the end of the decade would earn it a place alongside Enron as one of the world's worst corporate criminals. In 2009, Pfizer and one of its subsidiaries pled guilty to a felony violation for promoting a drug, Bextra, used to treat arthritis, for uses and dosages that regulators had specifically deemed to be dangerous and declined to approve. The result of that was people getting very sick and some people dying. And the company was fined $1.3 billion, the largest criminal fine in history. The third company I want to look at, you're seeing there's a theme here probably. The third company I want to look at is British Petroleum because it, like Enron and Pfizer, was a corporate social responsibility leader. Its former head, John Brown, was an avowed and an outspoken environmentalist. And the company branded itself more than any other and before any other as an environmental leader. It built solar-powered gas stations, which I always think, you know, good try, but it's kind of weird having the gas station run by solar power and then putting petrol in people's cars. But anyways, good try, A for effort. It ran sort of slick campaigns that, you know, touted various green credentials. It set up urban clean air programs in Atlanta and other major American cities. All of this cleverly masking the fact that the company was as bad, if not worse, than its competitors in the oil industry. Over the last couple of decades, BP has explored and drilled in some of the world's most environmentally sensitive areas, in Asia, in Prudhoe Bay up in Alaska, very controversial. It's routinely ignored and breached environmental and safety standards in the operation of its oil fields around the world. And it recently became notorious for the offshore oil rig explosion that nearly destroyed the Gulf of Mexico. And when you read reports in the aftermath of that, especially a very good one put together by a blue ribbon panel put together by President Obama, there is little doubt that that explosion was linked to a corporate culture of callous disregard for workers' safety and for environmental standards. Now, I'd be remiss, in light of recent events, not to add a fourth example, and that is Loblaws, a company that boasts of its commitment to social responsibility, of its, quote, positive contributions, and I'm reading, in our community, and its minimization of negative impacts on our environment, of its $45 million in charitable donations in 2012, of its, and perhaps this is the most important in light of the recent tragedy, quote, requiring its suppliers to uphold the right values in labor conditions. Yet, as is known now, in Bangladesh, a country where cheap labor fuels the success and profitability of Loblaws' low-cost apparel brand, Joe Fresh, and where factories are dangerously and notoriously unsafe. Just yesterday, there was another factory fire in that country that killed 8 people. In this context, the company, Loblaws, failed to prevent the deaths of now more than 900 workers, just about all of them women, from the collapse of a shoddily and recklessly constructed factory. And the shame of this is that things might have been different, and that Loblaws bears some responsibility for their not being different. In 2011, international NGOs, along with unions in Bangladesh, proposed a plan. And the plan accepted that the government agencies responsible were not working. There are thousands and thousands of factories in Bangladesh. What is the number of the staff of inspectors in that country? 18, 1-8. And so this system, this regulatory system wasn't working. So what the unions and the NGOs said is, let's do this contractually. Let's create an independent, legally binding regime with sufficient resources, sufficient authority to inspect factories, and importantly, to have the authority to shut down a factory immediately that is found to be subpar, either based on construction risks or fire risks or whatever. The plan was rejected by retailers when first put on the table in 2011. The plan was rejected again after a factory fire killed 112 workers last November. The company said it's too costly. You know what the cost is? The levy is $500,000 per company. Compare that to $45 million that Loblaws made in charitable contributions in 2012. They said it was too costly. They said they didn't like its legally enforceable norms, that they preferred to stick instead with voluntary, uneven, and non-transparent private auditing regimes that they already had in place. Now, and here's where the Loblaws piece comes in, as of a week ago, in the wake of this horrendous tragedy, some of the big retailers, including Walmart and Nike, have rethought their original rejection of the plan. They're now talking with the unions and NGOs that originally proposed it, but Loblaws, despite its expressions of regret and apology, despite its promise that this will never happen again, Loblaws has so far refused to take part in this process. Okay, there are 4 companies on the table. What do we make of all of this? Well, the first thing I think that we can say is there's a gap, arguably a yawning gap, between the pious social responsibility commitments of these companies and their socially irresponsible practices and actions. And some will argue, some will say that it's really not fair to look at Enron, Pfizer, BP, and Loblaw, as I am, that you can't really judge corporate social responsibility fairly on the basis of the exploits of companies that deploy it insincerely or at least incompletely. And they'll continue. What really needs to be done is to make sure that companies, not just these companies, but all companies, not only commit to the ideas of corporate social responsibility, but that they act in ways that truly reflect those ideas. And so in the end, they'll say, and this is a quite prominent argument out there, in the end, they'll say the problem is not with corporate social responsibility. The problem is with how the concept is being used, how it's being misused, how it's being underused, how it's being abused. And I want to take a different view. My argument, the argument I want to develop, is that the problem is with the concept of corporate social responsibility. Because what I believe is that to ask corporations, to expect corporations to be genuinely responsible is, getting back to the metaphor, is really no different than asking good cops to be genuinely good. Goodness is not, it cannot be, an actual attribute of either corporations as they're currently legally constituted or of good cops in terms of their institutional roles. It is a calculated strategy. It's a means towards serving the institutional ends, not towards serving the ends of the others that it purports to serve. So the point is that Enron, Pfizer, BP, Loblaws, in acting in the socially irresponsible ways that they have and that they do, and in strategically deploying corporate social responsibility programs, these companies are simply doing what all companies are programmed to do as companies, namely pursuing profit without concern, at least without genuine concern, for the interests of others, using whatever strategies are available, including the patina of corporate social responsibility, to shield themselves from adverse public opinion, to shield themselves from government scrutiny. The bottom line, if I can borrow a term, it's a good one, is that corporations, not just Enron, Pfizer, BP, Loblaws, but all for-profit publicly traded companies are deliberately designed, were deliberately designed at the end of the 19th century when they were designed, to be required by the law to be socially irresponsible when that is the best way to fulfill their self-interested mandates and missions. That's their job. Their job is to externalize costs, or to put it in other terms, to be socially irresponsible. Now, I'm not saying that socially oriented decisions are never made. In fact, they often are, increasingly more these days, and they're usually justified on the ground that they serve a firm's long-term interests. Even when you go to Loblaw's annual report, they say the reason we're doing these things is because it helps us attract customers. It's because it helps us grow our brand. And most companies, I mean, when I asked Mr. McKinnell, why does your company, Pfizer, do socially responsible things? He said there are 3 reasons. It helps attract customers, it helps attract employees, and it helps keep regulators off our back. So, you know, it's not a secret out there. When corporations and their officers are speaking honestly, they'll say, this is part of our business plan. And no doubt there are judicial decisions, like the one that Ed mentioned earlier, BCE, and there are legislative regimes in some jurisdictions that create some room for managers and directors to take account of other stakeholder interests. And no doubt, this is really important, no doubt managers and directors are often, as individuals, as human beings, sincerely committed to the socially responsible values that their companies are talking about. So my critique is never about the people who run corporations, it's about the institutional structure that often frustrates their human ambitions as well. But none of this changes, is my argument, the fundamental fact that corporate law, in terms of its overwhelming practice and effect, commands managers and directors to put their shareholders' financial interests above all other interests, to create an institution fundamentally geared to exploiting other interests in order to serve its interests, whether they be the interests of people or of nature, ignoring harms in pursuit of those interests, an institution fundamentally geared to externalizing its costs in order to create benefits for itself. That's the nature of the institution. And so being irresponsible, being socially irresponsible, I would argue, is a legal duty for corporations, whereas being socially responsible is a voluntary commitment. And that's kind of where we are. And that's why I would argue the very idea of corporate social responsibility is profoundly misleading and strategically and dangerously so. Because what it implies is that an institution deliberately designed to be socially irresponsible can in fact be socially responsible. And that's my first critique of corporate social responsibility, that it in effect masks the true nature of the corporation, and that in doing that, it changes, it channels our politics towards the organization, and that's problematic. The second critique of corporate social responsibility, which I'll turn to now, is broader. And it is that the concept serves as a broader ideological purpose than just masking corporate malfeasance. What I want to suggest is that corporate social responsibility is actually a pillar of a political economic movement that's been gaining steam over the last 30 years, and that commonly is described as neoliberalism. So it's often the case that people will talk about CSR as being something that counters neoliberalism by proposing a kind of morality in an amoral system. I disagree with that view. I want to argue that CSR is essential to neoliberalism and is a pillar of neoliberalism, because neoliberalism's core idea that free markets are the surest way to achieve the greatest good for individuals and society, it leaves little room for robust governance by public and public-oriented institutions. It necessarily narrows concepts like democracy, like equality, like freedom, to being mere adjuncts of market practices and norms. It limits the roles of governments to creating the necessary infrastructure for markets, while restricting those governments from imposing limits on those markets to protect broader public interests. Individuals should be free from governmental regulation to make their own choices and decisions, neoliberalism holds, and society should not and does not, the neoliberal creed continues, shape people's fates and fortunes. There is no such thing as society, indeed, as Margaret Thatcher once said. There are only individuals and families, as she continued. And there are also, Thatcher might have added, corporations. But she didn't have to add that, because within neoliberal ideology, it's simply taken for granted that corporations as legally constructed artificial persons, are in fact deserving of the same rights and freedoms as individuals. So in the name of individual freedom, and this is kind of the rabbit out of the hat, in the name of individual freedom, neoliberalism demands and has demanded over its 30-year run that corporate persons should be emancipated. This is a big freedom-fighting movement, should be emancipated from regulatory constraints. But we all know, and we all believe, that with freedom comes responsibility. We're taught this from the time we're very small. And neoliberals do not dispute that. And this is a really key point. They don't dispense with the need for morally referenced and restrained behavior on the part of either human individuals or corporate persons. What they do is to displace the site of moral governance from public and compulsory norms to private and voluntary ones. It's for the individual to choose to act morally, neoliberals believe. It's not for society and government to coerce them to act morally. So along with the demand of neoliberals that public regulation of corporations be removed, there's the companion demand that the resulting normative vacuum be filled with private self-regulation. And that is exactly where corporate social responsibility does its ideological work. It is the private and self-regulating normative regime that within neoliberal ideology does and should replace public regulation. And the logic of this is routinely rehearsed by business leaders, academics, government officials, who insist that corporate social responsibility is the answer to concerns about deregulation, that we can now trust socially responsible corporations to self-regulate rather than regulate them by law. I did an interview with the CEO of Goodyear Tires, Samir Jabara, the former interview, and he's a brilliant man and he articulated this beautifully. Corporations need to become more trustworthy, he said, because there has been a transfer of authority from the government to the corporation. And the corporation needs to assume that responsibility and needs to really behave as a corporate citizen of the world, needs to assume the self-discipline that in the past governments required from it. And in similar spirit, and you can find numerous statements to this effect, Gordon Brown, the former Labour Prime Minister of Britain, said several years ago that we can now replace the, quote, old regulatory system, close quote, with, quote, trust in the responsible corporation. Now, this position, so commonly advocated today, presumes that corporations can be trustworthy, that corporate trustworthiness and self-regulation can be a substitute for public regulation, which I think, you'll know I don't agree with. I think that's pure fantasy. I think in light of the corporation's true institutional nature, which I've already said is profoundly socially irresponsible, I think this faith is misplaced. I agree with, of all people, two of all peoples. One is the chief economist at Citibank, Wilhelm Buter, and he has this great quote. He says, self-regulation is to regulation as self-importance is to importance, you can see where this is going, as self-righteousness is to righteousness. So he said that in the wake of the fall of the economy or the financial sector in 2008, because he said, this is largely the result, and a lot of economists agree with this, Paul Krugman most famously, this happened due to deregulation. And so that's what William Buter said. Milton Friedman is a person I don't normally agree with on anything, but on this issue I do. When I was interviewing him, I asked him, can you give me a kind of metaphor for corporate social responsibility? Now, unfortunately, the metaphor he gave me is quite sexist, and I apologize for that in advance. And I ask you not to shoot the messenger. These are Milton Friedman's words, and they, I think, capture the idea well. He said, When you put a good-looking girl in front of a car to sell the car, you're not trying to sell beauty, you're trying to sell the car. And he said it's the same with corporate social responsibility. It is strategic. It's not about being socially responsible. It's about using that idea to sell the car or to sell whatever it is that you're trying to sell. So despite all of that, corporations continue today to succeed in positioning themselves as socially responsible, as trustworthy, as committed, as capable leaders on environmental, economic, and social issues, as worthy to be trusted to regulate themselves. Walmart and Nike, two examples. They invest millions of dollars each year in their sustainability programs up and down their supply chains. Nike recently stated, quote, "We're integrating sustainability into everything we do," close quote. Now, this is very seductive. Environmentalists and activists are working with these companies, NGOs, governments are deregulating them, confident that they're now okay, they can regulate themselves, they believe, they're talking the talk, they're walking the walk. Very powerfully seductive, this idea of the good corporation, very powerfully seductive to the interrogated suspect, the idea of the good cop. But when you think for a moment in this case, I mean, let's just take apart this idea of Walmart and Nike and their sustainability crusade. They're trumpeting sustainability, but while they're doing so, both companies are continuing aggressively to promote the expansion and growth of consumer markets. And in doing so, what they're doing is conveying a very clear message. And that message is that sustainability is perfectly consistent with spiraling consumerism and rising brand and corporate power. They're kind of hijacking the concept and narrowing it. It's one step forward and 3 steps back, is how Stacy Mitchell, a critic of Walmart, described it. She said, when you take the concept of sustainability and narrow it in this way to questions about how goods are produced and distributed, but not to questions about what kind of goods and in what quantities can be sustainably produced. And as a result of this kind of narrowing, a colleague of mine at UBC, political scientist Peter DeVerne, in a book that just came out, really good book called Eco-Business. And he says the big brand takeover of sustainability is shifting the purpose and goal of sustainability governance toward the need to create business value and away from more far-reaching understandings of the concept. So what seems like a very benevolent and very happy scenario, big companies taking on sustainability, the problem is they're going to take that concept on and they're going to interpret it in a way that's consistent with their basic business model. And that's going to then narrow it, and they have huge firepower in the media, in public relations, in marketing, to then get that message out. And the subtle thing that's happening is the very terrain of debate about sustainability is being narrowed. Now, what's really going on with all of this stuff, corporate benevolence, corporate goodness, corporate social responsibility, I think, is a massive corporate campaign to convince us not only that corporations can self-regulate, can regulate themselves, but also, and this is the scary part for me, that the good society, the path to sustainability, the path to social justice, will be brought to us not by public institutions and democratic governments, but by Coca-Cola, by Nike, and by Microsoft. And indeed, the CEOs of those very companies, those 3 companies, along with 11 other CEOs of major world corporations, recently got together at Davos, and they solemnly declared that the world's major corporations, themselves included, were now poised, indeed obliged, to assume the mantle of leadership on the world's most pressing problems. We are, they said in a solemn statement, a declaration, we are at, quote, a new frontier in corporate global citizenship and a new era in public-private partnership, close quote. And they said it was now their duty, the duty of corporations, to take the lead in, quote, building better governance systems and public institutions, close quote. God help us. They didn't say that, I'm saying that. So big business is part of the solution, not part of the problem. That's their message at Davos. Corporations are now to be seen as partners, indeed lead partners, not foes, not obstacles, in making the world a better place, in solving problems like hunger, like inequality, like injustice, like climate change. And this message has become a mantra for big business, especially over the last decade. And I go to these conferences, these business conferences. I'm always sort of brought in as the Christian to the lions kind of thing. We need to bring Bakan in, so it helps legitimate us, and we can have some good blood sport, arguing with them. So I go to these things, and this is what they're constantly saying, that whether it's on television, computer screens, marketing campaigns, or at these meetings of business people, at NGO meetings, academic conferences, business conferences, the message is clear: we are the solution. Big business is the solution, especially in the developing world. And perhaps most disturbingly, this is the message when progressive youth gather. At a recent We Day rally in Vancouver, 18,000 idealistic young people, high school students, came together to, quote, celebrate the power of young people to create positive change in the world, close quote. That's what the website said of this event. And the thing is that at this event, major corporations, their presence was overwhelming, their presence was ubiquitous, they were handing out free stuff, they were filling arena screens with ads for their products, Coke, Disney, these are high school students, Molson Beer, and boasting about all the good works that they do around the world. Ben Mulroney, not my favorite television host, but Ben Mulroney came out on stage and introduced a slick TELUS video as the crowd wildly cheered. Now let's watch this video, he said, about how TELUS believes in the power of young people to change the world. Corporations are the good guys. That was the message here as it was at Davos. They're the ones who should be relied upon to solve the world's problems rather than criticized for creating them. And that message, I believe, is having politically disastrous effects in our world today, because what it suggests is that private entities created as financing vehicles for entrepreneurship, innovation, and industry. I mean, that's why they were created. They were created originally to finance railroads and other large industrial enterprises. Created for that sole reason, not public institutions, not governments. These institutions should be entrusted to deliver the public good, to protect and promote the public interest. Privatization, deregulation, that is what this new image of corporate benevolence is really serving to justify. It is, in effect, putting one of those happy faces, a smiling face, or whatever those things are called when you're texting, an emoticon, a happy one, a smiling and seemingly progressive face on the key planks of neoliberalism. Yet, despite this ideological obfuscation, the brutal reality remains. The corporation, putting aside these sort of marginal changes and decisions like BCE and sort of constituency statutes in the United States and the possibility of benefit, at core, the corporation remains. There's nothing in its institutional makeup that should encourage us to believe it can regulate itself, or that it can be relied upon to respect public interests, or that it can be relied upon to value democracy, or to take the lead in solving world problems. I would not use a lawnmower to vacuum my living room rug. And essentially, using the institution of the corporation to try to achieve social and public ends is kind of like doing that. It's the wrong tool. It's the wrong institution. It has the wrong makeup to be a public-oriented institution. And that's, again, that's a reality that I and Milton Friedman agree upon. It's probably the only thing we agree upon. Now, importantly, some people will say, and this argument has to be put on the table, they'll say, okay, Joel, we agree with you. We agree that corporations are not going to all of a sudden become good, and yes, they are programmed in that way and everything else, but they'll still defend corporate social responsibility, and they'll defend it on the ground that markets for products, for services, for equity, for shares, that those markets can and will exert sufficient pressure on corporations to become socially responsible. That consumers and investors, informed by watchful media and internet-savvy civil society groups, will choose to buy and to buy from socially responsible companies, while punishing in the markets socially irresponsible ones. It's a very powerful argument out there, and I think it's a better argument than saying corporations are just all of a sudden going to become good. So this one says, okay, we accept how they are, but socially aware markets for shares and for products will drive social responsibility. The problem with this approach is that in addition to eviscerating any real or robust sense of what democracy is by effectively collapsing democracy into markets, because these terms are usually used: consumer democracy, shareholder democracy. In addition to that, I believe this approach is simply unrealistic and implausible. Individuals, when they're in their roles as consumers and investors, are at best highly unreliable and profoundly conflicted and unequal advocates for the collective good of society, not to mention the fact that 90% of the world, certainly the women in the factory that collapsed, are neither investors nor consumers. They are, for the most part, consumed in terms of their labor. So that's a problem. I mean, and even within the developed world, where we do have consumer power, consumers may sometimes pay slightly higher prices for products that are less harmful to the environment and that are made by companies that purport to be socially responsible. They may sometimes accept slightly lower returns from investments in purportedly socially responsible companies. But these slight sacrifices on the part of consumers and investors, combined with the fact that they're scattered, that they're voluntary, that they're uncoordinated, and that ultimately they depend upon a profoundly partial and distorted landscape of knowledge and information that's created by corporate public relations and corporate-friendly media. When you add all that together, the slight sacrifices we're prepared to make as consumers and investors will at best yield slight gains in terms of social and environmental values. And when we need to turn climate change around, and when we need to deal with radically and horribly unequal and unjust relations across this world, and dying oceans and everything else, slight sacrifices and slight gains are not what we need. So what is needed is another role, is another distinct role for individuals, unlike those of consumers and investors, one that explicitly and directly orients us towards the collective good of society and entrusts and empowers us to do something about that public good. And, stop the presses, we actually already have that role. It's called being a citizen. When we act as citizens, we're publicly minded rather than privately strategic. We're concerned with the collective fate of society, with social solidarity, with pursuing values and interests that are more than mere sums of individual preferences, values and interests that require collective public coordination and deliberation. And the problem I have is that the citizen is conspicuously absent in all the talk about consumer and investor power being used in the marketplace to regulate corporations, in all the talk about corporate social responsibility and self-regulation. Indeed, the implicit presumption here is that citizenship is a redundant role and of little or no value. Because if private individuals and private institutions, consumers, investors, putatively socially responsible companies, are charged with delivering the public good, where is the place for the citizen? And once the public good has effectively been privatized in this way, citizenship necessarily withers. And if citizenship withers, democracy withers. So the point is that inevitably, as we roll back public governance and regulation of corporations under the belief that they will become socially responsible, whether on their own or through the demands of consumer and investor markets. What we are really doing is rolling back democracy itself. We're narrowing the scope and impact of citizens' rights to political participation, to influence key issues about how corporations should be regulated, about how we as a society should balance the wealth-creating function of corporations against their potentially destructive effects on social and environmental domains. So let me commence with some concluding thoughts by saying this. If we care, for those of us who care about democracy, about social justice, about protecting the environment and people's health and well-being, about social solidarity, about the public sphere, we need to be very skeptical of and to challenge and to make it part of our work and activism to challenge the ideas that I've been talking about. The idea that consumers and investors can take the place of citizens in driving public policy. The ideas that markets for shares and products can take the place of public democratic institutions. The idea that corporations can be capable in significant and genuine ways of being socially responsible, that they can be trusted to respect public interests and values, that self-regulation by corporations can be a viable alternative to government oversight. We need to be skeptical and wary of these ideas because I believe they are compelling and rationalizing policies that threaten to diminish democracy itself. Creating a good, a just society requires commitment to certain values and social goods: democratic governance, civil and political rights, good jobs, reasonable incomes, access to health care and education, environmental protection, workers' rights, clean water, shelter, food. All of these and more are required if we want to build societies where people can shape their destinies and lead full and healthy lives. For corporations, because of the way they're constituted legally, not because the people who run them are mean or bad, but because of their institutional nature, and for markets, because of their institutional nature, these kinds of values and social goods have no intrinsic worth. They may be strategically endorsed in public relations and social responsibility campaigns, but they may just as likely be vigorously opposed, at least behind closed doors, when they demand policies and practices that clash with corporate interests. So the question then is, what do we do? What do we do as citizens? What do we do as activist thinkers, as critical thinkers about all of these things? And I don't have a magic bullet, silver bullet kind of answer. But, and Ed and I were talking about this before, I think that there are different courses of action where we can put our energies and our talents. We can opt for violent overthrow. I don't agree with that. History shows that doesn't work out very well. We can opt for continuing privatization of our collective stewardship of society. We can opt to become cynical and do nothing. Or we can opt for redemocratizing society, which is what I suggest. At the most basic level, what I think we need to do is we need to restore the legitimacy and the practice of public democratic institutions governing the economy, governing corporations, and governing us in the name of democratically defined public interests. I am a reactionary. I believe that the constitutional ideals that underlie our Western democratic societies are pretty good ones. I don't believe we've ever fully realized them. But I believe that, in fact, right now I believe our societies operate in ways that profoundly contradict them. But I believe they're good ideals. And so at the most basic level, I think we need to revitalize these ideas, these ideals, these practices of citizenship. We need to re-embrace the rights and duties of collective stewardship that citizenship entails. In the end, democratic governments, whatever else you might say about them, and there's a lot to be said about them, that's not very positive, but they are and they remain the only institutions in our current society that have sufficient authority, legitimacy, and mandate to set and enforce public-oriented rules and standards for corporations to abide by. Governments alone are able, through the enactment of laws and regulations, through, as Hans Kelsen talks about, the monopoly of coercive authority, they are able to demand that corporations be socially responsible, rather than just trusting and hoping that they will be. And so it's important in this regard to understand, really to recall what we once believed, that regulation, that law, is not government against the people, as its critics often charge, but rather a mechanism through which the people as citizens can protect and promote their collective concerns. And there's no question that governments fall short of these ideals that they're supposed to serve. There's no question that there are many places in the world where even those ideals have little or no purchase. And there's no question that there are real challenges to how to operate politically in a context where our political economy has become global rather than simply state by state. But I don't believe those are good reasons to abandon democratic governance and governments. I believe there are reasons to try to make them work and to try to make them work better, to realize and practice the ideals that lie at their foundations. I got in a lot of arguments during the Occupy movement. For some reason, my book, The Corporation, became a bit of a Bible for the occupiers, and so I was asked to speak at all these Occupy rallies. And every time I'd go and speak to the Occupy rally, I'd say, it's great, you know what you're doing, occupying the streets and occupying the Jiffy Johns and occupying the sort of, the hallways and bank lobbies and all of that. That's fantastic. But what we really need to do, and Ed and I were talking about this morning, what we really need to do is occupy government. Like, there's this thing that's sitting there that has all these levers and buttons of power, and that makes possible the things that we're criticizing. I mean, the notion that there's a free economy is one of the stupidest ideas that has ever existed. And it's stupid because the economy can only exist through a massive intervention of coercive state power. Who protects property rights? Who creates courts? Who provides the judiciary? Who provides the police force? Who builds the prisons? Who creates corporations? Who gives them limited liability? Who gives them the rules of that their directors can only serve the best interests of the country? I mean, where does that come from? You know, there was a panel on religion before. Maybe it comes from God, but I don't think so. I think God's a lot better than that. God wouldn't have created capitalism like that. That's my view anyways. But the point is that capitalist markets work because of a massive entitlement system created by government, created by the state, and paid for by the taxpayers. That is how markets exist. So my feeling is you don't abandon the place that's actually empowering the thing that you're up against, when in fact you can be there. You can be at the table. You can be at the table that's trying to figure out how to balance the legitimate wealth-creating function that corporations play in our society against how far are we willing to go in allowing that to happen in terms of other kinds of interests, and to have that discussion. We're moving towards a fundamentalist kind of logic in our society where only the one side seems to matter, where governments in the state are seen as basically their job is to create and sustain markets, not to deal with anything else. And I think that movements like the Occupy movement, in their own way, in saying we're not interested in government, are just falling into that problem. George Bernard Shaw once came up with this term. He said, socialism for the rich, capitalism for the poor, i.e., the government and state largesse works for the rich, and the poor have to suffer the so-called free market. And I think it's a very telling statement. And so we don't want to abandon the state. We don't want to abandon government. We want to occupy government. I'm not suggesting that this is easy. I'm not suggesting it'll turn things around tomorrow, but I think we are at a fork in the road. We're being given a choice between, on the one hand, continuing to weaken our public governance systems, continuing to privatize, continuing to depend more and more on corporations to govern themselves, continuing to be seduced into the belief as progressives that working with corporations and not working with governments is the way to go. That's one model. The other fork in the road, revitalize democratic governance, bring it closer to its original justifying ideals, make it more effective, make it better able to protect the public interest that it's designed to protect. I don't think is any surprise, think that that fork in the road, revitalizing democracy, is the way we need to go. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Bakan. So we will now take questions and comments. And if you could please be as brief as possible because we're running late so that everyone can get a chance.
Thank you. Thank you. I'd like to drink a couple of bottles of Bordeaux with you some night. I couldn't help but think about idle no more occupies government. When you're talking in the Starship Enterprise, there's that came into mind. But the whole idea of Solomon and Solomon, I always thought was kind of like the idea that this unexamined, that progress is a good, unexamined. And we're still living in that, and that's the idea of wealth creation. Why wealth creation? It's still, I mean, I challenge that. It's to provide what we need to sustain ourselves. We have two roles, two major things, is to care and share about each other and live in balance with the earth, the Great Mother. And so I always thought Solomon was at a much more early phase was a way of externalizing people taking chances, because and when we have to pay for it. So I still like to drink a couple of bottles of Bordeaux.
Yeah, too bad I don't live in Toronto, but I love Bordeaux. I think I don't know more is a really, and I think your comment about, I mean, I just agree with your latter comment, if I want to comment briefly on I don't know more. I mean, I don't know more, I think your statement was I can't see how it would occupy government, and I guess it would occupy self-government, and that's what I see I don't know more about. I don't know more is as I understand it, is a movement that is not anti-government, but it's suggesting that the current government don't reflect and don't represent and aren't accountable to First Nations people in this country, and that self-government is the vehicle that needs to be created for the exercise of public power on behalf of and representative of First Nations people.
It's everybody, though, that's the point.
Sure.
It's about building relationships and taking back what's been taken from us as human beings. All of us.
Yes.
Before continuing with the Q&A session, I just realized that Professor Wacer is going to, we will be responding to Professor Bakan. So you can go ahead.
So I'll be brief. And it was a great, again, set of question raising. I kind of wished we could have another hour where we came at it from the other end, which is Joel described many of the frailties of the corporation as an instrument and ended up 5 minutes out of an hour talking in very aspirational terms about sort of re-legitimizing democratic principles and governance in the public sector, and implied that maybe rolling back a little bit the role of the corporation might help unleash that process. I kind of wish we had been able to spend another hour on some of the challenges in re-legitimizing our democratic institutions, because the problems are common in each. You know, Joel talked about Enron, we could talk about the financial crisis, we could talk about Fukushima, Joel talked about BP. These were all preventable surprises. And when you drill down and see some of the common attributes of them, they have a lot to do with short-term incentives, a lot to do with lack of regard for externalities, true of almost all of the major private and public policy concerns we face today. They are all concerns in one way or another that relate to intergenerational equity. So we join on the notion that you should be occupying government. Where I'm less pessimistic, I suppose, and you know, there's always this tendency to reduce things to sort of the fairy tale, you know, there's a hero and a villain and a victim, and somehow we get to the happy ending. I'm not sure about the happy ending part. Where I'm less pessimistic about sort of the villain in Joel's articulation is I don't think it's true anymore to say that corporate irresponsibility is a legal duty. It may well be that practice lags the law, but I think particularly in common law jurisdictions, there is a massive re-articulation and reconceptualization of kind of the concept of sort of the corporation, its legitimacy, how it's disciplined. I think a lot of that is coming through a process of accelerating private standard setting into the law. BCE is just one example where, you know, the court engaged in almost this tautological reasoning, saying reasonable expectations are whatever reasonable expectations are. But by saying that, the court was, for purposes of a very narrow corporate law remedy, the oppression remedy, saying reasonable expectations can embrace all kinds of factors that until 10 years ago, people would have thought had nothing to do with corporate law, because the conceptualization of corporate law was shareholders as owners and the corporation as a profit maximizer. I can tell you that's no longer the case, and that's not the advice that boards get if they're well advised. I can point to all sorts of examples. We talked about these by email, cases like Vedanta or more recently POSCO, where OECD standards for multinational enterprises, which have no force of law, but which extend beyond the scope of sovereign lawmaking, get picked up by NGOs, in each case, NGOs who complain to the UK national contact person. The UK national contact person ends up legitimizing a complaint, in both cases having to do with activity in India. In one case, building a mine on a site that had religious significance, even though the mine siting had received all of the approvals in India, including from the Supreme Court in India. In POSCO, a Korean company going into the steel business in India without regard for human rights. In each case, a UK court intervening and basically saying you can't do that. So a UK court regulating conduct in India by multinational enterprises based on OECD principles that have no force of law. That's sort of, those are examples, and I could give you half a dozen others, of this process of accelerating private standard setting into legal norms. We need new metrics. We need new metrics that take into account externalities, whether they're accounting standards, standards for, you know, how we think about the cost of capital, how we reward corporate actors. We need to re-examine the purpose of the financial sector. 20 years ago, if you ask anybody, what's the purpose of a stock exchange? What are the purpose of financial intermediaries? You would get a reasonably common answer, and the answer would imply within it a social purpose. If you ask today, there's no social purpose, and most people can't tell you what the role. The stock exchange as an institution has changed fundamentally. It's no longer not-for-profit. It no longer is a means of raising capital. It's actually a means of extracting capital, because more money is being returned to shareholders as opposed through stock exchanges rather than raised through stock exchanges. So just as we need to re-examine the purpose and the legal norms around the corporation, we need to re-examine the purpose and legal norms and such basic concepts as limited liability, which over time has become less limited and will clearly become even, and should become, even less limited if we think about that concept in terms of social purpose. We need to do the same thing with respect to the institutions that mobilize and allocate capital in society. So these are examples of the kinds of processes underway, and they're all flawed and they don't happen quickly enough, in terms of hopefully re-legitimizing corporations as an institution. We need to have the same kind of institution about re-legitimizing other democratic institutions in the public sector. But we also need to recall that for better or worse, the corporation as an institution has generated a significant portion of societal wealth and perhaps even more importantly, innovation in our society. And I'll just close, and this is probably a bad example, but it happened on Monday. I was at a session in Cambridge talking about these kinds of issues, and one of the fellows there was from GE. And he had a little lapel, which was propellers, like a little, I forget what they're called, the things that you wear on, like if you have an Order of Canada, you wear these pins. His had these 3 little propellers, and I said, well, what's that about? And he said, well, that's the symbol, the logo for our wind turbine business. But it's not ours. This pin is actually an Enron pin, because we bought our wind turbine business from Enron when Enron was failing. We bought it out of the insolvency proceeding, and that wind turbine business became the stimulus for the whole Eco Imagination program, which is a significant cornerstone of GE's corporate purpose and has generated, and again, I'm not an apologist for GE, but has generated all kinds of innovation and solutions to public problems around the world. So even in the case of Enron, and I think this is sort of, in a sense, the genius of the corporation, you know, you can have this institution that can recreate itself, both at the individual level and at the systemic level, without flying apart at the seams. Again, that's not intended to be an apology or an offense of corporations, because Joel and I agree on much of what he talked about. It's intended to say we need to take a more systemic view, both of the problems and of some of the solutions.
So I want to hear some questions, but before doing that, I just want to very quickly say, yes, the corporation is a fantastic vehicle for innovation. I say that in my book, and in fact, in the book, The Corporation, I don't end by saying we should get rid of it. I say it's an important institution that can serve important public purposes, but it's not an end in itself, and that's how we often treat it today, number one. Number two, many of the innovations in the corporate form itself that Ed is talking about that are nascent now, and I'm not sure I'm going to exaggerate their import right now, but they show cause for optimism about where we may be going. And those are innovations of public institutions. Again, they're governments, they're courts that are reshaping the nature of the corporation. There's no doubt as we move forward that exercise of public power to deal with how you constitute the corporation, in addition to how you regulate it once constituted, is an important political project.
Thank you for the lecture. I want to ask about the end of it, the same point we come to revitalizing democratic government as the solution. Does that, to what extent does that not take account of the largest corporate merger of history? The corporate merger of government into the corporation, where citizens have become consumer citizens. So when you say government's the answer, isn't part of the problem that the way government is now, or the way democracy has come to be, is like corporate social responsibility, the good cop. We have term limits, you vote every couple of years, but it's turned citizens into consumers to see what they get out, to be governed by people who are just in and out of the boardroom, back to the government, who are really just managing the same corporation. So to just create, I think, the example of corporate social responsibility in America, where I come from, after the financial collapse, it's been, I don't know how much money, creating 3,000 pages of a Wall Street Reform Act that does nothing. But it's supported by, written by the people who will be in the boardroom
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's any, you know, I don't want to look at this through rose-tinted glasses or be naively optimistic. I just don't see any other way forward than trying to basically reclaim government, both government in terms of its institutional framework, but government in terms of our imaginations of it, and our imaginations of ourselves as just consumers rather than as citizens. And you know, that's the project I think we need to work upon. At the same time, you can look at existing governments today and you can see all kinds of reflections of exactly the kinds of things that government should be doing. You can see people mobilizing around certain policies, whether it's restricting chemicals in the environment to protect children, or restricting pharmaceutical companies. I mean, there's a lot of stuff going on, even within governments as corrupted as they are, that is environmental protection, that's really about the things that government should be about. So I think we need to be careful in the degree to which we kind of just abandon the whole project and say, oh, you know, but the problems you're raising, I mean, when 28%, I think, of 18 to 25-year-olds are voting, you know, and the rest are just on Twitter liking their favorite social responsibility company, that's a real problem. What I've decided in terms of, you know, my life on this earth and the privileges I've been given to be able to talk to people like you and others is that what I want to proselytize for is to try to, you know, a back to the future kind of way of trying to reclaim this idea of seeing our rights and responsibilities as more than whether we buy at Starbucks or Blends, or whether we buy at H&M or wherever, that, and as understanding government as actually the thing that we're supposed to be creating to govern us. Now, that may turn out to be a wasted project, I don't know, but when I look at, as I mentioned, when I look at the different possibilities of moving forward to try to deal with the problems our world is facing, I think that's likely to be the most productive. In a way, it's a pragmatic call. And part of that, I mean, you know, getting back to what Ed was saying, part of that is thinking about how we can recreate the corporation itself. That in itself is a political project. And that's a project we have to mobilize around. And the reason why the OECD and the reason why the UN Commission on Business and Human Rights and the reason why all this stuff is happening is because citizens, people, are saying we're demanding it. And so, you know, there's a lot of politics going on out there, and a lot of politics around the nature of the corporation itself, and a lot of politics around how we protect this earth and ourselves from the various externalities corporations are causing. So for me, it's a question of working in those streams. This whole talk is basically aimed at one purpose, and that is saying, do not be seduced, and I'm not suggesting any of you are, I don't want to be patronizing, but do not be seduced by this huge bandwagon that's driving through the main street of our society that says, we're the good guys now, jump on, and let's do it, and forget about those stodgy old governments because our best practices are better than anything they're going to give you. That's what I'm worried about. And statements like the CEOs at Davos saying, now it's our job to build the governance institutions of our society. That's really scary to me. And so that's all I'm trying to avoid in this talk. It's a fairly modest ambition.
I have a question about your conception of citizenship. I guess I was with you until you got to that bit. And I wonder how you are actually conceptualizing citizenship. And I think you alluded to it by saying the whether to the Western ideal of citizenship, et cetera. And so I wonder whether your conception of citizenship can actually hold in the current context, given the rise of the global south and all of the demands of the global south. And so maybe the Arendtian moment of, you know, the state, and you know, the state is there to protect human rights, and the paradox of human rights is correct. That moment may have passed, and so right now, I'm not so sure that the Western conceptions of citizenship can hold. And I'm not rights, the charter, etc., I'm not so sure that it's an ideal that we can legitimately put forward in the way we are being covered now. So I wonder if you can perhaps.
Yeah, I'm not sure what your counterfactual is in terms of a view of citizenship, but let me begin by saying that I would agree that our conception of citizenship probably should not be tied to a Western liberal conception of rights. And I wrote a whole book to that effect called Just Words, Constitutional Rights and Social Wrongs. So I think the kind of individuating tendencies of Western liberal rights, epistemology and ontology is actually corrosive of the kind of collective responsibilities and communal attachments that my view of citizenship would hold. I talk about collective stewardship of society. Now, if that collective stewardship of society is limited to collective stewardship of my society in Canada, and I really don't care about what happens to people in Bangladesh in unsafe factories, then for me, that also is a very deficient conception of citizenship. So to that extent, I would adopt a more communitarian approach to citizenship, and I would adopt a more global approach to citizenship, which I think is inevitable given that we as individuals are living in a society where globalized decision-making is happening, and we're hopefully part of it, but we're certainly often victims of it and sometimes beneficiaries of it. So I don't know, and I think that's consistent with what I said in my talk. I wasn't trying to take a narrow, I think I was talking about citizenship in a more philosophical sense than in any way that's anchored to a particular place, geography, and particularly a liberal individualist approach to it. But please come back at me if that doesn't.
We have time for one more question.
Thank you for a very interesting presentation. You're a law professor in a law faculty with students taking courses in law. I don't know what you teach, but if you teach business law, if you teach public law, what do you teach or tell your students in terms of their career aspirations in two respects? One, what do you tell your students who want to have careers as business lawyers? And two, what do you tell your students who want to have careers as social justice lawyers and who might be considering the appeal of going to a firm and working in the context of, say, on the inside of the business world to try to do progressive work? What would you tell each of those sets of students?
Well, the students who want to go and become lawyers in a business context, or the students who want to work in a community legal firm, I say the same two things to which I believe, and that is be good lawyers and be ethical lawyers. So that's the first thing I say. But I'll go a bit further because I understand that doesn't answer your question. Be good lawyers, be ethical lawyers. By being good lawyers, I tell them you need to understand the law. And I think there's a lot of obfuscation about what is going on in the law. So when I teach contract law, and I'm teaching the doctrine of consideration, which nobody ever understands, I say the doctrine of consideration is basically, and I don't say it in these terms, but it's basically Marx's commodity fetish, that it assumes equivalences between things that are not equal by abstracting them into this sort of transcendental ideal world of equivalence. So that's formal equality. Consideration makes sense once you understand that. It also elevates the notion of market bargain above all other reasons, including moral ones, for enforcing contract. But then there's a lot of tension because then you start to see more recent decisions that kind of say, well, maybe reliance should come in because maybe there should be some morality. So I teach law historically as a battle between attempts to turn it into an amoral system that basically reflects the amoralism of 19th century capitalist markets versus a more, for better, social welfarist or social democratic view where judges are saying it shouldn't all be about markets. I think that makes both the corporate lawyer and the social justice lawyer both hopeful and better lawyers. Because law is this normative conflict that they can see each of themselves in. And I say it's a noble profession because I believe that. Because I believe that if you're a business lawyer and you're ethical and you understand the limitations of the corporate form, that's a very good thing. Because firstly, it will make you a better lawyer. Secondly, it might make you critical of that corporate form. And then it might lead you, as Ed did, to go represent a company before the Supreme Court and try to push the envelope of that corporate form. So, you know, I mean, obviously, in a speech like this, I can't get into all the sort of legal detail of how I would approach corporate law, but I totally agree with Ed here. I teach my contract classes, I teach my commercial classes, and I teach my constitutional classes as lessons in history, and as in the history of the struggle that we as a society had, this grand struggle between a kind of communitarian sentiment and a kind of radical individualist sentiment, and that if you really want to be a good lawyer and understand how law works, you can't say it's one or the other, but you have to see it as this fluid debate between those two things, which has a place for everybody. I don't know if that answers your question completely, but.
Unfortunately, we've run out of time, so please join me in thanking Professor Bakan and Professor Waistra.
Thank you very much.
We will have a 5-minute break since we're running out of time. And yeah, so 5-minute break. And Dan has an announcement to make.
Well, you're all here. After the dinner tonight, I don't know if I'll go, depends on how many CDs I sell today. I have a gig from 8:30 to 9:30 at the Free Times Cafe, which is a whole block away from where the restaurant is. And I'm inviting you, it's $5 a pay, which you can support the artists and support the cause. We cannot eat applause. Come on down, just wander en masse down to the Free Times and have your after dinner, what do you call it? That's a before dinner. The after dinner one, or whatever, at Free Times, and support, and I would love you all to come down. Well, it's about a block away,